At 8:43 in the morning on July 2nd, 1937, a radio operator on a Coast Guard ship in the middle of the Pacific Ocean heard a woman's voice come through the static. She sounded exhausted. She was reading out a line of numbers, a navigation bearing, over and over. Then the signal stopped. That was the last time anyone officially heard from Amelia Earhart. She was 39 years old, the most famous woman in the world, and she was 7,000 miles into the final leg of a flight around the planet. She had about 22,000 miles behind her. She had roughly 7,000 left. She never landed anywhere again. Here's what makes this different from most missing person stories. The United States launched the most expensive air and sea search in its history up to that point. 9 ships, 66 aircraft. $4 million in 1937 money, which is close to 90 million today. They covered 250,000 square miles of open ocean. They found absolutely nothing. So here's the real question. In an era of radio, of naval fleets, of coordinated international search, how does a plane carrying the most watched pilot on Earth simply cease to exist? And why, nearly 90 years later, are researchers still finding new evidence? Start with what she was actually attempting. In 1937, flying around the world at the equator was not a stunt. It was the longest possible route, 29,000 miles, and nobody had done it. Earhart and her navigator, Fred Noonan, took off from Miami on June 1st in a twin-engine Lockheed Electra 10E, a plane stripped of passenger seats and packed with fuel tanks. They flew east, Puerto Rico, Venezuela, Brazil, across the South Atlantic to Senegal. Then Chad, Sudan, Pakistan, Burma, Singapore, Indonesia, and finally to Lee, New Guinea on June 29th. By then they had crossed most of the world. What remained was the hardest part. From Lee, the next stop was Howland Island, a strip of coral in the middle of the Pacific, 1.5 miles long, half a mile wide, barely 20 feet above sea level. It sat 2,556 miles away across nothing but open water. To find it, they would need to be accurate within a few miles after almost 20 hours of flying. Miss it, and there was nothing for hundreds of miles in any direction. Put that in perspective. Noonan was navigating by celestial observation, taking sightings of the sun and stars through a sextant, correcting for wind drift he could only estimate. A 1-degree error over 2,500 miles puts you 44 miles off target. Howland Island from a plane at 1,000 feet is visible from maybe 10 miles away in perfect conditions. And the conditions were not perfect. Photographs taken from the Itasca that morning show scattered cloud cover throwing shadows across the water, shadows that from the air look almost exactly like small islands. The U.S. government took this seriously. They built a runway on Howland specifically for her. They stationed a Coast Guard cutter, the Itasca, offshore to send radio signals she could home in on. Everything was arranged. And then almost everything went wrong. The first problem was the radio. Earhart's plane originally carried a trailing wire antenna, a long wire that unspooled behind the aircraft, necessary for transmitting and receiving on lower frequencies. Before the flight, it was removed. Accounts differ on exactly why. The leading explanation is that the crew found it cumbersome to reel out and considered it unnecessary. Without it, the Electra could not effectively use the very frequencies that direction-finding equipment relied on. The second problem was that Earhart and the Itasca were, in effect, speaking past each other. She transmitted on 3105 kilocycles. She asked the ship to transmit on 7,500 kilocycles so she could take a bearing. But the direction finder on her aircraft could not reliably use 7,500 kilocycles. When the Itasca sent the signal, she reported hearing it, and then reported she could not get a minimum, meaning she could not determine what direction it was coming from. The third problem was scheduling. Earhart transmitted on a fixed schedule, at 1/4 and 1/4 to the hour, and often did not stay on to listen for replies. The Itasca heard her clearly. She apparently heard almost nothing from them. For hours, one side of a life-or-death conversation was simply not connecting. At 7:42 in the morning, her voice came through the Itasca's speakers, strong enough that crew members said it sounded like she was overhead. She said, "We must be on you but cannot see you. Gas is running low." At 8:43, the final confirmed message. She gave a navigation line, 157-337, a bearing running northwest to southeast through the position where Howland should have been. Then silence. The search began within an hour. The Itasca steamed north on the assumption that she had overshot into open water. The battleship Colorado launched seaplanes. The aircraft carrier Lexington arrived with 62 more planes. For 16 days they searched. They found no oil slick, no debris, no life raft, no bodies. It was as if the Pacific had closed over the whole thing, and officially that is where the case ended. On July 19, 1937, the search was called off. In January 1939, Amelia Earhart was declared legally dead. The Navy's conclusion was simple. She ran out of fuel, crashed into the ocean near Howland Island, and sank. But here's the twist that has kept this open for almost 90 years. That conclusion has a problem, and the problem is that people kept hearing her. In the days immediately after the disappearance, radio operators across the Pacific and North America reported picking up faint distress calls. Most were dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications, but a number of them were harder to explain. A teenage girl in Florida named Betty Clenk wrote down what she heard in a notebook over nearly 3 hours, a woman's voice giving a name that sounded like Earhart's, pleading for help, and a man's voice in distress in the background. Her notebook still exists. She was 15. She had no reason to invent it, and she said nothing publicly about it for decades. Some of the details she recorded, including references to water rising and a male companion who was injured and disoriented, match circumstances no one outside the aircraft could have known in July 1937. A separate signal was picked up in Melbourne, Australia, another by an amateur operator in Texas. Several were reported by the U.S. Navy itself. In at least 3 cases, radio operators independently took bearings on the source, and the lines they drew crossed in roughly the same region of the Pacific, southeast of Howland. Here is why those signals matter technically. The Electra's radio could only transmit if the engines were running to power it. The engines could only run if the plane was on land, upright, and dry. If Earhart went down in deep ocean water, the plane sinks in minutes, and every subsequent transmission is impossible. So if even a handful of those post-loss signals were real, then the plane did not sink immediately. It landed somewhere. That single deduction is what launched the modern search, and it points to an island 350 miles southeast of Howland, sitting almost exactly on that final navigation line she transmitted. Its name is Nikumaroro. In 1937, it was uninhabited, and people have been finding things there. In 1940, a British colonial officer named Gerald Gallagher discovered a partial human skeleton on the island, along with the sole of a woman's shoe, a sextant box, and a bottle. The bones were shipped to Fiji, examined, and classified as belonging to a stocky European male. Then they were lost. That would have been the end of it, except the measurements survived in the file. In 2018, forensic anthropologist Richard Jantz ran those original measurements through modern statistical analysis and compared them against Earhart's known dimensions, taken from her clothing and her pilot's license. His conclusion, published in a peer-reviewed journal, the bones were more similar to Earhart than to 99% of individuals in a large reference sample. That is not proof. The bones themselves are gone. But it is a serious, testable finding that the 1941 analysis got wrong. There is more. Searchers on Nikumaroro have recovered a piece of aluminum aircraft skin, campfire sites with the remains of birds and fish and clamshells opened in ways islanders did not typically use, fragments of a woman's compact, and pieces of a jar consistent with a freckle cream that Earhart was known to use because she disliked her freckles. Then there is the photograph. A 1937 British survey photo of the Nikumaroro shoreline shows an object protruding from the reef. In the decades since, analysts have argued it is consistent with the landing gear of a Lockheed Electra. Others say it is a natural feature. The debate is unresolved, and in 2024, a sonar image from a deepwater search team appeared to show an aircraft-shaped object on the ocean floor about 100 miles from Howland. When they returned to verify it, the shape turned out to be a natural rock formation. That is the pattern this case follows. Every few years, something surfaces that seems like it might finally close it, and every time it dissolves under examination, or it holds up just enough to keep the question open. So the honest answer is that we still do not know. The simplest explanation remains the official one: fuel exhaustion, ocean sinking. It fits the navigation problems, the radio failures, and the complete absence of wreckage, but the Nikumaroro evidence is not nothing. A skeleton with measurements matching an unusually tall woman, personal items that don't belong on an uninhabited island, distress signals that are physically impossible unless the plane was on land. None of it is conclusive. All of it is uncomfortable. Which brings us back to that radio room on the Itasca on the morning of July 2nd, 1937, and the last thing anyone officially heard. She was not screaming. She was not panicking. She was reading out a navigation line carefully so that someone could find her. Somewhere out there, either 2.5 miles down in the Pacific or under the coral and crab burrows of a small uninhabited island, is the answer to a question the world has been asking for almost 90 years. And the strangest part is that the last message she sent may have been telling us exactly where to look.